Today we celebrate the fifth Sunday after Pentecost. I've been talking about worldviews and the components that go into worldviews. This comes from the class I'm teaching for my nurses, and we look at the prime reality as the first component of a worldview. This prime reality can be anything that governs all of the rest of the aspects of our lives. In the Christian worldview, of course, the prime reality is God. But it can be many other things that people choose as the guiding force, the guiding principle, the foundational value, however we want to describe it. So within the Christian worldview, the prime reality is God. The psalm from our scriptures today gives us an insight into the character of God, and it should be very familiar to us because I've often referred to it, beginning with the text from Exodus, where in Moses' exasperation with the people of Israel, he asked God for a self-revelation. God, tell me who you are. God, show me, as if he might have been from Missouri, but God, show me who you are, and then when I go back to the Israelites, I'll tell them, and then they will have confidence in me as their leader and will be stronger in their belief in you. So God says to Moses, well, come up on the mountain, probably Mount Sinai, and I will show you who I am. I'm not sure what Moses expected when he went up on the mountain, but in any event, God passes by Moses, and the text in Exodus says, God passed by Moses and was heard to say, a God, slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness. I think of the prime reality within the Christian worldview as being rooted in that understanding of God. That God is not a concept, a theological construct, or a theological or spiritual idea, but rather God is about action, activity. That it's a very dynamic reality that we come to understand God to be. That God is slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness. I've got several images on the wall behind me, and I know it might be offensive to some who are not Catholic, but in my Catholic tradition, images were not bad things. Rather, images, as the icons on the wall show, were doorways into the spiritual realm of the divine, if you will. And so when we think about having a prime reality of God who is slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness, the idea is that we look into this character of God perhaps to discover who we are, right? The text in Scripture also reminds us in Genesis that we are in the divine image and likeness. So we are best exempling or showing or witnessing to God in the world when we ourselves are slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness. And the images of the icons open a doorway for us into God, that we look at the physical world that is right in front of our noses, but the invitation is to look more deeply into the reality and the character of God. Why should we do that? Well, the text in the Psalm says, the last line of the text says, and God will lift up all of those who are down, discouraged, depressed. So that when we come to view God, or when we come to understand God, we are given the opportunity to look deeply into the mystery of God, if you will. And in doing so, are raised up. Our spirits are raised up. Even our physical realities are raised up. In my class with the nurses, that they're learning that spirituality has to do not just with spiritual things, but rather spirituality can lead us to have a better, healthier life, if you will. It's been proven. I heard the story and read the many scientific reports that they took a group of Buddhist monks out into the elements, out into the cold of Tibet, and invited them to enter into their practice of meditation, because the scientists wanted to see what effects meditation had on the physical body. They knew it had some kind of effect on the spiritual, emotional aspect of the human person, but they just wanted to test to see. I wonder if they even had already drawn conclusions that it wasn't going to have any effect whatsoever. And yet, as they studied these monks, what they discovered was that the practice of meditation actually lowered their body temperature, lowered their heart rate, and they survived unharmed. There was nothing physically that had happened to them out in the cold, out in the elements. I think the scientists were astounded that a good practice of meditation or a good practice of mindfulness actually changed the physical metabolism of the human body, so that there was an interaction between their reflection, their deep reflection, meditation, on how they came out of it to view the world and how their physical bodies felt afterwards. I say all of that because the psalm that ends on the phrase that if we come to this deeper reflection on God, who is slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness, if we enter more deeply into the reflection of God, pass by the physical surface, let's say, of those icons, and look more deeply into who God is, then perhaps it will have a positive effect on our bodies, our mental state, our spiritual understanding. So when we come to the gospel, and the gospel today picks up a text, and we actually missed some of the verses earlier in the text, the lectionary chose to use the verses at the beginning of chapter 11 in Matthew for another place in the lectionary. But the story begins with Jesus wondering, having heard that John the Baptist is in prison, wondering about messiahship, wondering about the mission, wondering about the work of the reign of God. And disciples come from John to ask Jesus the question, "Are you the Messiah?" They're wondering, is he the one who's been promised? And Jesus doesn't say, "Yes, I'm the Messiah." Jesus says instead, "Well, what did you see? What did you see?" The blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear, prisoners are set free. People's lives are being changed and transformed by the gentle word of Jesus, by the loving embrace or the loving touch of Jesus. The disciples go back in wonderment, and then Jesus kind of reflects on this whole experience of John's disciples coming with the question, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus gives a very strange image. It's not in our script. It is in our scriptures this Sunday. And Jesus says, children were sitting on the street and the curb, and they were looking out on the people going about their ways, taunting them. I think about it. I've said in the scripture reflection that I sent out, I think about children, how children can be kind of mean in their language, and thinking how often I might have said, "Nah, nah, 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 we got something better than you." I say that because the children sitting on the curb in the story of the gospel suggest that the taunt that they're given is to the adults out on the street going about their business. Because you see, in the text, it suggests that they come asking if Jesus is the Messiah when they've seen everything. They've had the physical evidence, not necessarily of Jesus being the Messiah, but they've had physical evidence that the reign of God is in their midst. The blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear. Wasn't that proof or evidence enough? And so the children's taunt, "We played a song for you and you didn't dance," are meant for the adults. You have proof and evidence, and yet you go about blind and deaf and hard-hearted and stubborn and arrogant. And then the text moves from that image to, what the text today, and it's a familiar verse, I'm sure, "Come to me, all who are labor and burdened down, and come to me and you will find rest." That was actually the last line of the psalm. that God will lift up those who are burdened, who are bowed down. The connection I think we need to make is that we adults don't believe the evidence, right? We right now live in a time, oh no, wearing masks, that has nothing to do with anything. Oh no, if we stop testing for the virus, it'll just go away. Regardless of the fact that people will continue to get sick and people will continue to die. So whether we test or not isn't going to change that fact, right? So the evidence is before us. Well, what's the evidence? The evidence takes us back to God, back to the prime reality, right? That God is slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness. And so I have to ask, have we experienced that of God? Do we experience God that way? Or is God still the punisher, the destroyer, the vengeful one who whips out a gun and blows everybody up because somehow or another God is offended by sin and by degradation? Well, I don't read that at all in the scripture. And I kind of push the language to the extreme so that maybe it does become offensive to us because it's all around us. Offensive language about God, about our Christian traditions and our Christian faith. But wow, rhetoric can whip us up into an angry fit. Wow, now wait a minute. If the text says that God is slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness, it doesn't mean that we become passive in the face of hate and violence. It means we become active. You see, that's what these images of the icons behind me attempt to do, that it moves us past the reality of the world that we can only see with our physical eyes into the spiritual realm where we see with the eyes of faith, so that when we come back out of that realm, we're changed and transformed because we've seen something that we maybe didn't see before or didn't experience before, the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the mercy, the compassion of God. Laying down our burdens doesn't mean that we just give it over to God and let God take care of it. That's not it at all, you see. Laying down our burdens and finding rest in God means that we find rest in the compassion, the love of God. I tell the story, and I've used it before, I tell the story that when I was a kid, I would frequently, as maybe even I still do from time to time, lose control in anger, fits of anger, lose my temper. And I remember one of those instances in which, losing my temper, my mom grabbed me. And of course, if you grab somebody who's already out of control, it just seems to make it worse. And I struggled against her embrace, and she grabbed me and pulled me close and just wrapped her arms around me as tight as she could. And I didn't get it at first. I just struggled against it. And she kept holding me tight against her breast. And I remember now, after 60 plus years maybe, I remember her beating heart, her gentle breathing, and it began to calm me down. I tell that story because that's what the word compassion means. God's womb-like mother-father love. There it is. You see, the icon takes us into the mystery of God that maybe, like the children's taunt, we're so quick to judge, we're so hard-hearted, we're so stubborn, we're so blind, we're so reliant upon ourselves that when it comes to understanding the compassion and the mercy of God, it's almost as if we've never experienced it. But I bet if you're a parent that you've done this to your child, of holding them tight in an embrace of love, and hopefully you were, as an adult, at one time held tightly by your mother or father in an embrace of love. And you know what? That to me, after 60 plus years, was one of the most powerful experiences of God I've ever had. It's still with me says a lot, right? So when I think about laying burdens down, it has to be the burdens of hate, of anger, frustration, maybe even the burdens of our racism, our prejudice, the thoughts of violence, the thoughts, I'm going to do what I want to do and to heck with everybody else. All of those things are what we're blind and deaf and hard-hearted about that really do prevent us from seeing God and coming to know the compassion, the mercy, the forgiveness of God. So, today, the invitation is to experience in your life slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. And the reason why I ask you to experience that, because every time you practice it, every time you experience it, you're encountering God. See, Jesus said the reign of God is in our midst. There it is. The reign of God is in our midst, and we experience God when we practice being slow to anger, rich in mercy, when we are steadfast in love, and when we abound in kindness. That's what the rest at the end of the text in the gospel today is about. It's not the nap we're going to take this afternoon, but rather the rest is falling back into the shalom, the peace, the salam of God, the shalom, the balance and the harmony we need to have with God, the balance and the harmony that comes from God embracing us with an abundance of love. Have a great day today. Next week, we're going to do a Zoom service, so watch for information on that. Have a great day today, and God's shalom and peace be with each of you.